the harmony of the world is made manifest in form and number. In the last episode, we stepped into the world of sacred numbers, from the monad to the decad, the platonic solids, the circle, and the strange reoccurring pattern of 9. Not as random abstractions, but as a language, a way the ancient world understood reality. Number was not just quantity, it was quality, meaning, structure, and order, a way of reading the hidden architecture beneath the visible world. Now we apply that language to stone. Because if numbers are the alphabet, then the Great Pyramid of Giza may be one of the oldest messages ever written. The second narrative tells us it was a tomb, a royal monument, a structure built for death. And maybe that is part of the story. Maybe the Egyptians did use it that way. But the question is not whether Egypt used the pyramids. The question is whether Egypt originated the knowledge behind it. Because the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to believe that it's a tomb explains everything. So in this episode, we are not looking at the pyramid as tourists. We are not approaching it as students repeating the second narrative. We're approaching it as readers. Because if the pyramid is a message, then we have to ask, what does it say? Welcome back to the third narrative. Let's begin with the second narrative, the official story. The pyramids were built during Egypt's Old Kingdom, when pharaohs ruled as divine kings and commissioned monumental tombs for the afterlife. The Great Pyramid of Giza is attributed to Pharaoh Khufu of the 4th dynasty. It originally rose about 481 feet into the sky. Each side of its base was around 755 feet long. It covered more than 13 acres, and it was built with more than 2 million limestone blocks, many weighing several tons. The official story claims that a workforce of 20,000 to 30,000 laborers built it over 20 to 30 years using primitive tools. Workers supposedly quarried the stones by hand, hauled them on sleds, and lifted them up massive ramps, stone after stone, layer after layer, until the greatest monument of the ancient world stood complete. That is the story. A tomb, a pharaoh, a large workforce, a ramp, and that's it. End of discussion. And once again, we are handed the most lifeless explanation for one of the most extraordinary structures ever built. Think about it. Even if the second narrative were completely true, even if the pyramid was built exactly when they say, exactly how they say, and exactly for the reasons they say, it would still be one of the greatest achievements in human history. So why is the story made so boring? Why are we trained to memorize the answer instead of stand in awe of the question? The Great Pyramid has survived empires, earthquakes, wars, religions, languages, and civilizations. It has watched the world change around it for thousands of years. And still, the approved explanation is basically, it was a giant tomb built with basic tools and enough labor. That is not enough. Not because ancient Egyptians were incapable, but because the pyramid itself seems to be telling us something more. Its precision, its alignment, its proportions, its strange ability to attract the same numbers, symbols, and patterns we have been tracing all season. That is the real problem with how history is taught. History is not presented as a mystery to be investigated. It is reduced to names, dates, timelines, and approved conclusions. Memorize, repeat, and move on. But the past is far more fascinating than that. And if the Great Pyramid is more than a tomb, then the question is not only how they built it, the question is why. Why this form? Why these proportions? Why this mountain of stone that still seems to speak the language of number? To answer that, we have to stop reading the pyramid as a grave and start reading it as a text. Let's begin with one of the strangest arguments, the idea that the Great Pyramid encodes Earth's dimensions. The Earth is not a perfect sphere. It is slightly flattened at the poles and slightly wider at the equator because of its rotation. Modern science calls this an oblate spheroid. That difference is not enormous, but it matters. The Earth's equatorial diameter is roughly 26 miles wider than its polar diameter. That small variation is important for geodesy, satellite navigation, and any precise model of the planet. Now here's where the story becomes interesting. The second narrative tells us that around 240 BCE, the Greek mathematician Eratosthenes measured the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy for his time. Using shadows, distance, and geometry, he estimated the Earth's circumference at around 25,000 miles. Then, much later, Isaac Newton mathematically argued that the rotating Earth should not be a perfect sphere, but should bulge at the equator and flatten at the poles. Later measurements refined that, and modern satellite confirmed it in detail. So the second narrative gives us a timeline. Eratosthenes gives us the size of the Earth. Newton gives us the shape, and modern science confirms the details. But then, we come back to the Great Pyramid, and suddenly, the timeline becomes uncomfortable. Because when we take the pyramid's dimensions and scale them up by a factor of 43,200, the numbers come very close to the dimensions of the Earth. Let's do the simple version first. The Great Pyramid's original height is about 481 feet. Its base side is about 755 feet. That gives a base perimeter of about 3,020 feet. Now let's multiply those by 43,200. 481 feet times 43,200 equals 20,779,200 feet. Divide that by 5,280 feet in a mile, and you get about 3,935 miles. The Earth's polar radius is about 3,950 miles. That is only about 14 or 15 miles off. That is less than 1%. Now take the pyramid's base perimeter. 3,020 feet times 43,200 equals 130,464,000 feet. Now divide by 5,280 and you get about 24,709 miles. The Earth's equatorial circumference is about 24,901 miles. That is off by about 192 miles. Still less than 1%. Now that alone is interesting, but we are not done. The Great Pyramid isn't built directly on sand. It stands on a raised stone foundation. Pyramid researchers have also argued that if you include the raised foundation beneath the pyramid, the numbers get even closer. The pyramid's adjusted height becomes 482.76 feet, and the adjusted perimeter becomes 3,043.43 feet. Using the adjusted height, we can multiply 482.76 times 43,200, and that gives us about 3,949.85 miles. The Earth's polar radius is about 3,949.89 miles. That is almost exactly the Earth's polar radius. It is off by just 0.04 miles, about 200 feet. Using the adjusted perimeter, we can multiply 3,043.43 times 43,200, which gives us 24,900.79 miles. Earth's actual circumference is 24,901 miles. That is almost exactly the Earth's equatorial circumference, a difference of just 0.2 miles, around 1,000 feet. Now, I want to be careful. Those adjusted numbers are a part of the pyramidology argument. They are not how mainstream Egyptologists would frame the monument. But even if we leave the adjusted version aside, the basic relationship is still difficult to ignore. At a scale factor of 43,200, the pyramid's height scales close to Earth's radius. Its perimeter scales close to Earth's circumference. So what are we looking at? A coincidence? A clever mathematical accident? Or a structure deliberately built to mirror the Earth? If the builders encoded these proportions intentionally, then they were not merely stacking stones. They were measuring the world and translating that measurement into architecture. Now, why 43,200? Why that number? Why not 10,000 or 100,000? To the second narrative, this is where the conversation usually ends. They say it's a coincidence, numerology, pattern seeking. It's nothing, move on. But to those who understand the ancient language of number, the same language we decoded in the last episode, 43,200 is not random. It belongs to the same family as 432, 108, 2,160. These numbers keep appearing in sacred time, in the yuga cycles, in the seconds of a day, in the symbolic measurement of the sun and the moon. Now, a skeptic can say those numbers are selected, rounded, and symbolic, and sometimes that is true, but that is also the point. The ancient world worked symbolically. It preserved knowledge through proportion, rhythm, number, and correspondence. So if the Great Pyramid uses 43,200 as a scale factor, then it is not just a measurement. It is a signature, a way of saying this structure belongs to the same code, the same language, the same system of time, earth, heaven, and number. And if that's true, then the pyramid was not simply built on the earth. It was built as an image of the earth, a miniature model, a stone reflection of the planet itself, the earth written into form. Now let's bring back another idea from the last episode, the circle and the square. The circle represents heaven, wholeness, eternity, and the infinite. The square represents earth, matter, foundation, the four directions, and the physical world. The pyramid marries the two. Its square base rests on the earth. Its height rises towards the sky. Its form takes matter and turns it upward. And mathematically, the Great Pyramid seems to encode the relationship between the circle and the square. This brings us to pi. Most people associate pi with later Greek mathematicians, especially Archimedes, who gave one of the great classical approximations by bounding a circle's circumference with polygons. But the Great Pyramid appears to encode a pi-like relationship long before Archimedes. The perimeter of the pyramid's base is about 3,020 feet. Its original height is about 481 feet. Twice the height is 962 feet. Now divide the base perimeter by twice the height. 3,020 divided by 962 equals about 3.1393. Pi is about 3.1416. That is about 99.93% accurate. Again, we can argue about intent, we can argue about the exact original dimensions, and we can also argue whether the builders meant to encode pi or whether the slope's geometry naturally produced it. But either way, the relationship is there. The square base and vertical height generate a circle. Earth and heaven meet in number. The pyramid becomes a way of squaring the circle, not as a classroom problem, as a sacred statement. The circle of heaven brought down into the square of earth. The infinite translated into the finite. The divine order made visible through stone. That is exactly the worldview Pythagoras later represents. That the universe is built from harmony. That number and form are not dead abstractions. They are the language of God. And if the pyramid is speaking that language, then we have to ask the forbidden question: who taught the builders how to speak? This is where the second narrative begins to feel incomplete. We are told that the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom built the Great Pyramid using copper tools, ropes, sleds, ramps, manpower, and organization. And I want to be clear, ancient Egyptians were not stupid. They were not primitive in the childish way the modern mind imagines. They were brilliant, organized, symbolic, mathematical, and spiritually sophisticated. The third narrative is not trying to insult ancient Egypt. It is trying to honor Egypt more deeply. Because the real question is not whether Egyptians could build. The question is whether dynastic Egypt invented the knowledge behind the pyramid, or did they inherit it? Where did the sacred mathematics come from? Where did the astronomical precision come from? Where did the obsession with death, resurrection, Orion, Sirius, the sun, and divine kingship come from? Why does Egypt appear so complete so early? Why does it feel less like a beginning and more like a continuation? Maybe Egypt was not the origin point. Maybe it was a receiver, a place where fragments of lost science were preserved, reorganized, and carved into stone. And that brings us back to Atlantis, not as a fairy tale, but as a possible name for the world before the break. A civilization whose knowledge did not vanish all at once, but flowed outward through survivors, initiates, priesthoods, and symbols. Manly P. Hall argued that Atlantean initiates carried sacred doctrine into Egypt before the collapse. That is not mainstream archaeology, but it is an esoteric lens, and it explains why Egypt became the great chamber of ancient wisdom. And in that chamber, one figure stands above the rest: Thoth. In ancient Egyptian tradition, Thoth is a god of writing, wisdom, measurement, magic, calculation, and sacred knowledge. He is the scribe of the gods, the recorder, the measurer, the keeper of divine order. He was connected with the moon, time, language, mathematics, and the hidden laws that structure reality. Later Greek tradition identified Thoth with Hermes, and from that fusion came Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary master of the Hermetic tradition. So when we speak of Thoth, we are not just talking about one Egyptian god. We are talking about an archetype, the divine scribe, the keeper of the old science, the one who writes the order of heaven into language, the one who preserves wisdom after catastrophe. Later esoteric traditions go even further and remember Thoth as an Atlantean figure, a survivor, a teacher, and a transmitter of ancient knowledge. And I'm not presenting that as literal proof, but symbolically, the image matters. Because every lost world story needs a carrier, someone who survives the flood, someone who brings the knowledge into the next age. In the first narrative, that figure is Noah. In Greek memory, it may be Prometheus. In Egypt, it is Thoth. And if Egypt inherited older knowledge, then Thoth becomes the mythic image of that inheritance. Atlantis to Egypt, Egypt to Pythagoras, Pythagoras to the West. A living current of number, symbol, and sacred science. And nowhere is that current more visible than in the Egyptian story of death and resurrection, the story of Osiris. We have touched on Osiris before, when we talked about solar resurrection, when we talked about the dying and rising god, when we discussed Taurus and the sacred bull, where Egyptian religion later tied the Apis bull into the Osiris tradition. But now Osiris becomes central, because Osiris is not just a mythological character. He is the key to understanding what the pyramid may have meant. In Egyptian religion, Osiris is the lord of the dead, the god of resurrection, fertility, and eternal return. His story is one of the most powerful in the ancient world. Osiris is betrayed by his brother Set. He is killed, dismembered, and scattered. Then Isis, his sister wife, gathers the pieces and reassembles him. Though one part of it remains missing, his phallus, Isis still conceived his child, Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship. This is not just drama. It is cosmology, death, fragmentation, reassembly, and rebirth. The king dies, but kingship returns. The body falls, but the soul ascends. The world breaks, but the pattern is restored. And in Egyptian star religion, Osiris is connected with Orion. The pyramid texts speak of the king joining the imperishable stars, ascending and becoming part of the divine order. The dead king does not simply remain in the tomb. He rises into the heavens. He joins Osiris, and he becomes star-born. This is why the Giza complex becomes so interesting, because the three main pyramids have often been compared to the three stars of Orion's belt. This is the Orion correlation theory, and it is debated, but the broader symbolic connection between Osiris, Orion, kingship, and the afterlife is not random. Egyptian religion already places the soul, the king, Orion, and resurrection in the same symbolic field. So when we look at the Great Pyramid, we should not only see stone. We should see a body of geometry designed to move the king, or perhaps the initiate, from earth to heaven, from death to life, from matter to star. And then the deeper question appears. How old is this pattern? Did Egypt invent it, or did Egypt inherit it? This is where the ancient Egyptian king lists become important. The Turin king list, preserved on papyrus from the New Kingdom, is one of the most important ancient lists of Egyptian rulers. It does not begin the way a modern history textbook begins. It preserves the memory of rulers before the pharaohs, gods, semi-divine beings, spirits, before mortal kings. Then Manetho, the Egyptian priest writing in the 3rd century BCE, preserved a similar structure. His history of Egypt, known mostly through later writers, also begins with divine and semi-divine rulers before the historical dynasties. Now, modern historians treat these early divine reigns as mythology, and maybe that is fair. But the third narrative asks a different question. Why did Egypt remember its own past this way? Why did its chronology begin not with ordinary kings, but with gods and demigods? Why does Egyptian memory point backward to a time before dynasties, when divine beings ruled on earth? This does not mean we should treat every number in the king lists as literal chronology. Ancient sacred numbers often work symbolically, but the structure matters. Gods, demigods, spirits, then mortal kings. That pattern should sound familiar. Because in the first narrative, before the flood, we meet the sons of God, the daughters of men, the giants, a corrupted world that must be reset. In Plato's account, Atlantis is ruled by the descendants of Poseidon, 10 divine kings who eventually fall into corruption. Different traditions, but same structure. A memory of divine rulers, a fall into corruption, a flood or catastrophe, a world rebuilt from fragments. And if those memories point back into the deep ice age, then they bring us back to the Cro-Magnons, to Lascaux, to the cave walls where the sky may have been encoded long before Egypt rose on the Nile. In episodes 2, 5, and 7.1, we looked closely at Lascaux, not as primitive cave art, but as possible cosmic memory. The bull as Taurus, the 4 dots in front as Orion, and the 6 dots above as the Pleiades cluster. Then we looked at the falling horse and the standing horse, representing the solar path. The possibility that Cro-Magnon artists were not merely painting animals, but mapping the sky. If that reading is correct, then the Taurus-Orion pattern appears thousands of years before dynastic Egypt, long before the pyramid texts, long before Khufu, long before the official beginning of civilization. And that changes the question, because if Orion appears in the cave, and Orion later becomes central to Egyptian resurrection theology, then perhaps Egypt was not inventing the star religion. Perhaps Egypt was preserving it. The cave becomes the first page. Giza becomes the stone edition. And the same sky appears in both. The bull, Orion, death, fertility, resurrection. Mainstream archaeology sees Lascaux as Ice Age art or hunting symbolism. And maybe it is all that. But the third narrative asks, what if it was also astronomy? What if the Cro-Magnons were memory keepers of a world before the flood? What if they preserved the same cosmic system Egypt later carved into temples and pyramids? Then the Great Pyramid is not an isolated miracle. It is the culmination of an older tradition, a tradition of aligning earth with heaven. And the same signature appears again across the ancient world, at Lascaux, where light, animal, and sky may converge, at Newgrange, where the winter solstice sunrise enters the passage and illuminates the chamber, at Stonehenge, where the stones align with solar turning points, at Abu Simbel, where sunlight enters the sanctuary on specific days. Again and again, ancient sacred structures do the same thing. They measure light. They catch the sun at the threshold. They turn architecture into a calendar. They align the human world with the heavens. And the Great Pyramid belongs to that family. Most people think of it as four-sided, but its faces are subtly concave, creating a hidden eight-sided geometry. This is not obvious from the ground, but under certain lighting conditions, especially around dusk and dawn on the equinoxes, the divided faces become visible. Whether that was designed as a calendar marker or simply a construction feature is debated, but symbolically, it fits the pattern perfectly. The pyramid hides its deeper geometry until light reveals it. That is initiation. The message is in the stone, but the stone waits for the sun. So now we arrive at the central question. Why was the pyramid built? Not by who, not how, but why. Because once you understand the why, everything else begins to shift. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with a margin of error of just 0.05 degrees. That kind of precision is still astonishing. Its proportions echo the circle and the square. Its scale can be read as a model of the Earth. Its geometry participates in the mathematics of 43,200. Its symbolism connects Earth and heaven. Its surrounding complex participates in Egyptian star religion. Its hidden geometry interacts with the light. And its location has inspired endless debate. One famous modern claim says that the Great Pyramid's latitude mirrors the numerical value of the speed of light. The speed of light in a vacuum is 299,792,458 meters per second, and a latitude near the pyramid's position is 29.9792458 degrees north, mirrors that number digit for digit. Now I want to be honest, I would not build the whole case on that. The metric system is modern, the decimal coordinates are modern, and skeptics are right to point out that one can choose a precise line of latitude to make that match appear more dramatic. So I'm not presenting it as proof, but I'm also not going to pretend it means nothing. Because in a monument already saturated with numbers, proportion, alignment, scale, and cosmic symbolism, even the strange coincidences become part of the atmosphere. Not proof, but a question. And the question becomes even more interesting when we look where the pyramid sits. Alternative researcher Robert Spivey has argued that Giza lies close to a major planetary crossroads, near the meeting point of the longest land-based Great Circle route and the longest line of constant latitude over land, which supports the larger question: why this place? Why this monument? Why this precision? Because if the builders were thinking the way the ancient world often thought, then location would not be random. A sacred site was not just a place where people worshipped, it was a point of contact, a place where earth and heaven could meet. In many ancient traditions, the earth was not dead ground. It was alive, a body, a field, a living system with centers, currents, and lines of force. So if the Great Pyramid was placed at a meaningful point on that body, maybe it was not simply marking a royal tomb. Maybe it was marking a node, a place where earth, number, geometry, and the sky converged. That does not sound like a tomb. It sounds like a tuning fork, a device designed not merely to endure time, but to interact with it, to resonate with the planet, to translate earth into number and number into stone. And this brings us to the next question. If the pyramid was meant to work with energy, how was it built to do that? This is where the power plant theory enters. Engineer Christopher Dunn proposed that the Great Pyramid was not originally a tomb, but a machine, a power plant, a device designed to use water, vibration, stone, chemistry, and geometry to generate or transform energy. His theory is outside mainstream archaeology, but it is worth understanding because it asks a different kind of question. Not where is the mummy, but what was the structure doing? Let's look at the material. Most of the pyramid's body is local limestone. Its outer casing was once smooth, white Tural limestone, brought from quarries across the Nile, giving the pyramid a brilliant reflective surface. Inside, however, the story changes. The king's chamber is built from granite brought from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south. That matters because granite contains quartz, and quartz has a known property called piezoelectricity. When quartz is placed under pressure or vibration, it can generate an electrical charge. That does not automatically prove the pyramid was a power plant, but it makes the question more interesting. Why bring granite from so far away? Why place it inside the inner chambers? Why design spaces that behave acoustically in unusual ways? Why does the pyramid feel less like a simple burial chamber and more like a resonant body? Dunn argued that the pyramid drew energy from the earth itself. In his model, low-frequency vibrations moved through the limestone bedrock and into the pyramid. Those vibrations traveled through the structure. The granite responded, the chambers amplified sound, and the internal passageways helped move the energy through the system. He also argued that the queen's chamber may have functioned as a chemical reactor, producing hydrogen gas that moved upward through the pyramid's interior. Again, this is a theory, but it is not a random theory. It is built around features that are difficult to explain if the pyramid was only a tomb. The block shafts of the queen's chamber, the salt deposits on the chamber walls, the strange acoustic behavior of the passages, the massive granite structure of the king's chamber, the evidence of resonance, and the complexity of the internal design. The key is not any single mechanism. The key point is the pattern they suggest together. A structure that is not passive, but responsive. Not decorative, but functional in a way we may not fully understand yet. The Great Pyramid behaves acoustically. It resonates. Sound carries through it in strange ways. And Dunn believed that this was not accidental, but part of the design. So why assume the greatest monument of the ancient world was silent? What if it was meant to resonate? What if the Great Pyramid was a tuning instrument? A stone machine built to hold, amplify, or transform subtle forces? Not a monument to death, but a monument to life. And this brings us back to the question of time. When was this system built? The second narrative tells us the Giza complex belongs to the Old Kingdom, the pyramids to the 4th dynasty, while the Sphinx dates to the age of Khafre, around 2500 BCE. That places the monument in the age of Taurus. And if the Sphinx were simply an Old Kingdom royal statue, that may be enough. But through the solar archetype theory, we developed in 7.1, another possibility appears. If ancient builders used zodiacal animals as timestamps, if Lascaux may have preserved Sagittarius through the horse, if Taurus, Aries, and Pisces each leave their symbolic imprint on the religions of their age, then what do we do with a giant lion facing the eastern horizon? The Sphinx is not a bull, it is a lion, and the lion belongs to Leo. Using the same great year model we have been tracing, the age of Leo falls roughly between 10,800 and 8,640 BCE. That is not a small detail. That takes us back before dynastic Egypt, back toward the end of the last ice age, back toward the same window where flood memories, lost civilization theories, and the Atlantis question begins to converge. So what if the Sphinx is not merely a statue? What if it is a timestamp? A lion facing the rising sun, a monument looking east, a sign pointing not only to a king, but to an age. This is speculation, but it is not random speculation. It follows the same symbolic logic we have been building. Each age a symbol, each symbol a timestamp. If the builders wanted to mark Taurus, why build a lion? If they built a lion, why ignore Leo? And if the Sphinx points to Leo, then the Giza complex may preserve a memory far older than the 4th dynasty. Maybe the Egyptians inherited it, restored it, reinterpreted it into their own royal theology. But perhaps the original message was older, written not in ink, but in stone, in shape, in the sky. At this point, two stories compete for the truth. The second narrative says the Great Pyramid was a tomb, built for Khufu, raised by organized labor during the Old Kingdom, a massive human achievement. And again, that story is not worthless. It preserves real history, but it may not be the whole story. The third narrative says something else. The Great Pyramid belongs to a much older symbolic system, a system of number, proportion, harmony, light, resonance, and celestial alignment. A system that appears in Lascaux, in the Great Year, in the Zodiac, in Pythagoras, in Egypt, in Atlantis, in the mystery schools. The pyramid was not merely stone piled upward. It was knowledge made physical, a structure that mirrored the earth, squared the circle, marked the heavens, measured light, resonated with the body of the planet, and possibly belonged to a larger grid of sacred architecture. That is why the tomb explanation feels so small, not because tombs did not matter to the Egyptians, but because this monument seems to speak a language older than burial, a language of creation itself, numbers, geometry, vibration, and light. The same code we have been following since the beginning. So what have we found throughout this series? We began in Genesis, where creation unfolds through patterns, a world shaped by number, sequence, and divine speech. We followed the flood, where civilization is destroyed and reborn. We followed Atlantis, the memory of a world that rose, abused power, and fell. We followed the Cro-Magnons, the memory keepers of the Ice Age, painting the heavens into caves. We followed the serpent, the symbol of energy, awakening, knowledge, and danger. We followed the Zodiac and the Great Year, the cosmic clock of the ages. We followed Pythagoras, who preserved a worldview where music, mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and the soul were one science. And now we stand before the Great Pyramid, the monument where all those threads converge. Stone, stars, numbers, earth, light, and resonance. This is where the third narrative becomes more than a theory about the past. It becomes a way of seeing reality. Because if the ancients were right, then the universe is not chaos. It is order. a living matrix of number, vibration, consciousness, and form. A design intelligent enough to encode itself into stars and stones, into breath and music, into geometry and myth, into the human body and the monuments of the gods. Once you see that, you cannot unsee it. The myths align, the math repeats, the monuments hum, the symbols return, and the past stops looking primitive. It starts looking encrypted. But this is only the beginning, because the ancients did not only build in harmony, they also warned of dissonance. They knew that the same energy that creates worlds can also enslave them. The same knowledge that aligns can be inverted. The same architecture that awakens can be turned into control. So now the story moves from form to frequency, from sacred geometry to vibration itself. Next, we follow the spiral deeper into Fibonacci, the golden ratio, the hidden relationship between number, nature, music, and life. Because if the pyramid was built from the mathematics of God, then the next question is unavoidable. What does that mathematics sound like? I'll see you in the next episode.